My name is Derek Langston. I'm 41 years old. For nearly 12 years, I worked as a senior systems architect at a mid-sized tech firm based in Seattle. I wasn't the kind of employee who needed to be the center of attention. I just wanted to build things that lasted. I'd show up early, leave late, and put my soul into code that only a handful of people even understood. I wasn't chasing praise. I was building legacy. But in the end, the legacy I was building wasn't mine. It was his. My supervisor, Alan, had joined the company 2 years before everything unraveled. He wasn't smarter, he wasn't even technical. But he had charisma, the kind that made boardrooms believe he knew things. I thought we made a good team. I handled the deep systems logic, and he handled the clients. But slowly, I started noticing something I couldn't unsee. My ideas were showing up in meetings I wasn't invited to. Diagrams I'd sketched in solitude were being presented as departmental brainstorming. His name always floated to the top. Mine faded deeper into the back end. For over a year, I had been working on a proprietary system architecture, an intelligent load balancing algorithm that could cut client server costs in half without losing performance. It was the kind of work that could reshape our entire business model. Every weekend, every spare hour, I'd refine it. It was personal, intellectual, and unlike anything on the market. I stored it in a separate encrypted directory on the company drive, just to keep it safe until I was ready to present it to leadership. But I made one mistake. I trusted Alan when he said he wanted to preview it first. 2 days later, my entire directory was gone. Not corrupted, not misplaced, deleted. When I asked Alan, he didn't even flinch. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Start over. It wasn't up to standard. I saved you from wasting more time." That was the moment I felt something inside me snap, but not the way most people do. There was no rage, no panic, just a chilling clarity, like I'd stepped into a different version of myself, one that had been quietly watching all along. I went home that night and stared at my ceiling until the sky turned pale. It wasn't the lost work that haunted me. It was the realization of what I'd been blind to. This wasn't the first theft. It was the final one. And what Alan didn't know, what he had completely underestimated, was that I had kept a private local mirror of the project, an entire blueprint, untouched. He'd deleted a shadow. The original still lived, and that changed everything. I didn't tell a soul, not even my closest colleague, who'd quietly warned me months earlier that Alan was a bit too smooth. I simply smiled, nodded, and told Alan the next morning that I'd start over from scratch. I let him believe he'd erased a year of my life. In reality, I had just begun the most strategic chapter of it. There's a strange kind of silence that comes when your heart stops trusting someone you still have to smile at. That's the silence I walked in every day after that. I said nothing. I didn't hint. I didn't sulk. I just let Alan believe I was broken. And in his arrogance, he believed it. That was his weakness. He fed off control, not intelligence. And intelligence, when it hides in silence, becomes dangerous. I spent my days pretending to rebuild the project. But in truth, I was refining the real version, offline and away from prying eyes. Each improvement I made felt like reclaiming a piece of myself he had tried to erase. I documented everything, timestamps, original code, design flows, version histories. Not because I needed to prove anything yet, but because I knew that someday I might need to. That someday the silence would speak louder than his voice ever could. There were moments I almost spoke up. Meetings where Alan took credit for our team's research, emails where he subtly positioned himself as the project's brain. But I kept repeating one thing to myself: let him climb higher, let him think the ladder is his, because when it falls, the fall will be longer, unwitnessed. The emotional toll was real, though. There were nights I'd wake up angry at myself more than him, for being so trusting, for not seeing the patterns sooner, for letting someone like that speak into the future I'd built with my bare hands. But then, a quiet reminder, you're not late, you're just not loud. And loud doesn't win wars, precision does. The company started investing in Alan's vision, the one he stole from me. They approved funding for what they thought was his idea. He smiled more, made more promises, and shook hands in meetings I was never invited to. But behind that smile, he didn't know he was walking on a fault line, one I had started carefully carving. I didn't want revenge in the way most people think of it. I didn't want his job. I didn't want to see him suffer. I just wanted the truth to stand, to breathe again in daylight. Not for applause, but for correction. And the only way to get that was to make sure the right people saw what they were never supposed to. Every great downfall begins with a pattern no one's watching. And I had started watching Alan very closely, not with suspicion but with discipline, his schedule, his habits, the people he seed on emails and the ones he carefully excluded. He was building a story around himself, and I let him. But I also knew that even a story built on lies leaves fingerprints, and all I had to do was follow them. I began reaching out quietly, anonymously at first, not to gossip, not to expose, but to verify. Former co-workers from Alan's past companies had stories too, whispers of brilliant pitches that weren't his, products that magically appeared just before a quarterly meeting. One engineer even told me he was always the last to arrive, but somehow the first to present. The pattern wasn't new, it was just finally in the open, at least to me. Then something unexpected happened. A former colleague I trusted deeply, someone who now worked at a competing firm, reached out after seeing one of Alan's press features. "Didn't you design something like this a year ago?" he asked. My throat tightened. I had said nothing. I had shown no one. And yet the architecture Alan was now presenting, it was mine, bit for bit. I didn't even have to explain. My friend already knew. That conversation changed everything. Because while Alan had been marketing my work under his name, I now had someone outside the company who could verify its true origin. My friend connected me with two senior engineers at their firm, people I respected. They listened, they reviewed my files, and then they made me an offer. Not a job, but a collaboration, a platform, a stage. They said, "Let the product speak, build it, launch it, we'll support the back end, and let the market see the real architect." But I wasn't ready, not yet. Because my victory wouldn't be complete if I simply escaped. No, I needed to let him walk into the trap he built, and for that I had to stay, to smile, to nod, to play the game a little longer. So I told my new allies, "Give me 6 weeks. I'll deliver the system, I'll time the release. And I'll make sure he's still bragging when the ground vanishes beneath him." Those 6 weeks were a test of patience. I didn't know I had. Alan was riding high, featured in an industry blog, scheduled to speak at a regional tech summit, boasting about his upcoming breakthrough. But he was bragging about a house built on sand, and I was standing on the rocks, blueprint in hand, waiting for the tide to rise. The summit was announced on a Monday. Alan would be presenting the future of adaptive infrastructure to an audience of CEOs, investors, and press. I sat 2 rows behind him in that same morning's team meeting as he pitched the plan to leadership. No one questioned him. No one looked in my direction. They didn't know the architecture he was promising had already been built, just not by him. I stayed late most evenings playing my part as the loyal developer, helping him rebuild. But when the office emptied and silence fell like a curtain, I'd plug in my personal drive and work on the real version, the one I would soon unveil. My collaborators at the competing firm were ready. They'd secured a private server, beta testers, even a soft launch campaign. All they needed now was my signal. That signal would come on the same day as Alan's big speech. But there was one more piece I needed: proof of theft, not suspicion, not implication. Evidence. And I found it in a place Alan never expected anyone to look: the metadata logs on the internal server backups. Hidden inside a restore cache from 3 weeks ago was an activity trail. It showed my original files being downloaded by Alan's account at 2:13 a.m. on a Sunday. No authorization request, no collaborative note. Just theft, masked under admin privilege. I documented everything. I screen captured the logs, encrypted the files, stored them across 3 different drives, one at home, one at the competing firm, and one with a lawyer friend who owed me a favor. It wasn't about lawsuits or drama. It was about ensuring that when the moment came, no one could erase the truth again. Not with a smile, not with a title, not with charm. The night before the summit, Alan ordered the entire team to stay late to polish the final build. I watched him strut through the office with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. He even made a toast with some cheap sparkling cider and said, "Tomorrow, we make history." I raised my cup and said nothing. In 12 hours he'd be absolutely right, just not in the way he imagined. I went home and barely slept. Not out of anxiety, but focus. I wasn't walking into war. I was walking into balance. For the first time in a year, I felt aligned. I was no longer trying to prove myself. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply restoring truth. And truth, when it walks in silence, shakes foundations. The morning of the summit, the air felt different, sharper, like it had been waiting for this. I arrived early, dressed simply, without fuss. Alan showed up 45 minutes late, flanked by interns and grinning like he'd already made it to the cover of Forbes. The presentation room was sleek, modern, filled with tech executives sipping bad coffee and rehearsing polite applause, and Alan, of course, loved an audience. He took the stage like a performer. Slides flicked across the screen behind him, showcasing my system, renamed, rebranded, stripped of its soul, but dressed in buzzwords. I watched as he described processes he didn't understand, diagrams he couldn't explain, solutions he hadn't solved, and I knew anyone with true technical literacy would start to see the cracks. He was skating on ice too thin for his weight. At exactly 11:06 a.m., my collaborators triggered the public beta release of my original system on a partner site. Within minutes, the platform lit up. Tech bloggers, early adopters, back-end engineers. The algorithm ran smoother, faster, leaner than anything on the market, including what Alan was fumbling through on stage. And attached to that release was a white paper authored by me, timestamped, annotated, and peer-verified. The truth didn't just walk in, it walked in with receipts. By 11:30 I noticed the first shift. 2 executives from a competing firm stood up and walked out of Alan's talk, heads down, phones glowing. A journalist opened their laptop mid-presentation and began typing furiously. Alan paused, confused, stammered a line, and moved to the next slide. But the silence in the room had changed. It wasn't polite anymore. It was skeptical. Back at the office, my manager texted me, "What's going on? Your name is all over this new release. Is this the same thing Alan's been demoing?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I'd already delivered a detailed summary of the incident, the logs, the timeline, and the supporting evidence to the company's legal and HR teams earlier that morning, under legal advisement and with a time-stamped envelope. Alan finished his presentation 10 minutes early and left the stage in forced applause. He looked pale. The hallway outside buzzed with low voices. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to see the moment he realized the walls were closing in. I had done what I came to do, and the system, the real system, was no longer his to present. That afternoon, a quiet email went out to our division from HR. Please be advised that Alan Crane will be on extended administrative leave, pending internal review. All questions may be directed to Derek Langston, who will serve as interim lead on infrastructure development. No drama, no confrontation, just silence, rebalanced. The office was quiet the next morning. Not tense, just different. People were more polite around me, more careful. But it wasn't fear. It was something closer to awareness, the kind that only comes when a hidden truth finally surfaces and everyone realizes they were watching the wrong story all along. I didn't gloat, I didn't change. I simply kept doing what I'd always done, build what matters and protect what's real. HR asked me to step in temporarily while they investigated Alan's conduct. I agreed, but only on one condition. I didn't want his role. I didn't want the title, the corner office, or the politics that came with pretending to be important. I just wanted a small, focused team, people who loved the work more than the spotlight. They gave me exactly that. And for the first time in years, I felt free inside the place that had once felt like a trap. A week later, I received a package at home. No note, just a leather-bound notebook I recognized instantly. It was mine, my original sketches, my early drafts. Somehow, Alan had kept a physical copy. Maybe guilt had crept in. Maybe it was cowardice disguised as an apology. I didn't reply. I placed it on my shelf between two programming manuals I hadn't opened in years. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Legacy doesn't live in recognition. It lives in truth. Alan's departure became a quiet footnote in the company's timeline. No scandal, no lawsuits, just an empty office and a recycled email address. But in tech circles, people started talking. Not about him, but about the system, about how it came out of nowhere. Leaner, smarter, faster than the innovation pitched at the summit. And eventually they started saying my name in the same breath. I didn't correct them, I just nodded. Truth has its own way of echoing. Outside of work, something shifted in me. I stopped apologizing for being the quiet one, for building slowly, for protecting my vision instead of selling it fast. I began mentoring younger developers, teaching them not just code, but boundaries, how to document everything, how to trust slowly, how to walk in rooms with quiet confidence, even when louder voices tried to claim their work. I never set out to ruin Alan, and in a way I didn't. He did that himself. I just refused to let him take me down with him. I chose silence with strategy, dignity over drama. And in the end, I didn't just get my work back, I got my power back. And once you've tasted that kind of peace, no thief can ever take it from you again. A few months after the summit, our team was thriving again. We'd trimmed the fat, removed the pretenders, and built a culture of quiet excellence. No more forced smiles, no more politics, just purpose. We weren't the biggest team, but we were becoming the most respected, and for the first time in my professional life, I felt like I was part of something built on truth, not illusion. But success brings attention. One day, a recruiter from a top-tier firm called me directly. They had seen the system, traced its origins, and done their homework. They didn't just want the software. They wanted the mind behind it. They offered more money, more freedom, and more support than I'd ever been given before. But I hesitated. Not because I didn't want it, but because I wasn't done here, not yet. I negotiated a different kind of deal. I'd stay at my company part-time as a senior advisor to help rebuild its culture. Meanwhile, I'd partner with the new firm to develop the next version of my system from the ground up. No stolen credit, no middleman, just clean ownership and full creative control. It was the balance I had been waiting years to find. Alan never reached out. Not to apologize, not to explain. And I'm glad he didn't, because nothing he could have said would have mattered. I wasn't looking for his remorse. I was already beyond it. The best closure I could ask for wasn't an apology. It was a world where I didn't need his permission to create, to lead, to shine. And that world was finally mine. Every once in a while someone new will join the team and ask what happened to Alan. The older team members just glance at each other and shrug. There's no need to speak of it, not out of fear, but because we've already moved forward, and the truth has a way of fading into strength once it's done its work. Looking back, I realized something. I wasn't just rebuilding a system, I was rebuilding myself, my voice, my standards, my sense of worth. And while the betrayal hurt, it also became the catalyst. I didn't lose a year of work. I found a lifetime of clarity. There's a moment, just one, that stays with me. A quiet afternoon, a few weeks after everything settled, I was alone in the office, reviewing architecture specs for a new client. The light hit my desk just right, and I paused, realizing I wasn't tense anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to pull the rug out from under me. I wasn't defending my space. I wasn't shrinking. I had arrived. The old version of me, the one who avoided conflict, who gave people the benefit of the doubt, long past the point of reason, that version didn't die. He just grew up. He learned that boundaries are not walls, they're gates, and the key should never be handed to someone who hasn't earned it. Alan didn't steal from me because he was smart. He did it because I handed him trust, wrapped in silence. But silence doesn't mean surrender, and I had reclaimed that silence for myself. When I finally launched the second version of the system through my new partnership, the reception was beyond anything I imagined. It wasn't flashy, it didn't trend on social media, but the right people noticed. And those people, technical, thoughtful, deliberate, reached out, not to praise, but to collaborate. I wasn't chasing spotlight, I was building something that would last. And that to me was everything. Alan's name disappeared from the tech circuit, quietly, almost pitifully. Last I heard, he was consulting for a startup overseas, one that wouldn't survive its first year. But I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt nothing. That's how you know you've healed. When the people who hurt you lose their power to stir anything inside you, not anger, not sadness, just stillness. In time, my story became a lesson I shared with new engineers, not in bitterness, but in caution. Document your work. Know your worth. Protect your ideas, not with paranoia, but with wisdom. And never confuse charisma with character. One will fill a room, the other will build a foundation. And me, I finally knew what legacy really meant. Not just code or products, but how you carry yourself when no one's watching. How you respond when your name is stolen, and how you rise not loudly, but completely. It's strange how quickly people forget who held the knife once the bleeding stops. In the months that followed, the office never mentioned Alan again. His name was quietly wiped from internal documentation, leadership charts, even the hallway directory. But I remembered not to carry bitterness, but to remember how easy it is to be erased if you don't anchor yourself in truth. I didn't need a vendetta. I had my version of justice, and it was clean. One of the biggest moments of validation came not from within the company, but from a former client who had unknowingly been pitched Alan's stolen vision. They reached out, confused, after testing the real platform post-launch. Why does this run so much better than what we were shown at the summit? I sent them a short reply with my signature at the bottom, and no other comment. A day later, they cancelled their contract with my former employer and signed on with the new firm I had partnered with. That was the day I realized I no longer had to explain who I was. My work spoke fluently in every room I entered. Despite everything, I didn't seek to destroy anyone. Alan collapsed under the weight of his own ego. That's what happens when you build your reputation on someone else's back. You don't just fall, you vanish. And the silence that follows isn't dramatic, it's complete. I never posted about it. I never name-dropped. I just kept building and let the world correct itself. The most powerful revenge is restoration. Not of the job, not of reputation, but of inner peace. Because betrayal can strip you of a lot. But if you reclaim your integrity, your voice, and your sense of self, you win. Quietly, completely, and permanently. Alan thought erasing my work would erase my future. But what he deleted was just a shadow. The real thing lived where he couldn't reach. Sometimes I wonder if he ever sits alone and remembers my face when he said, "Start over." The arrogance, the dismissal, the smug confidence that he'd buried a year of brilliance with one keystroke. And I wonder if he realizes now that those words didn't mark my end. They triggered the beginning of something bigger, something he had no place in. I don't forgive him, but I've released him. And that, more than anything, is how I know I've won. Because the story didn't end with his betrayal. It began with my response. There's a kind of power in restraint that most people never understand. It's easy to scream when you're wronged, easy to seek validation through outrage. But real strength, I've learned, is in staying still while others unravel. Alan unraveled without me ever raising my voice. And every silent step I took away from him was a declaration. I am not what you tried to define me as. In the months that followed, I began to receive invitations to speak, not about the scandal but about the technology, industry panels, university guest lectures, webinars. People were curious not just about the system, but about the philosophy behind it. I spoke quietly, truthfully, and without bitterness. I didn't need to expose Alan. His absence from the room said more than I ever could. Eventually, our competitor turned partner offered me a permanent role, head of vision and infrastructure, not because I demanded it, because I had proven that my work wasn't a fluke. It was a foundation. And they wanted to build on it. I accepted, but I negotiated one more thing, a mentorship program for young developers, so they wouldn't have to learn the hard way who to trust and how to protect themselves. Back at my old company, the shift was palpable. The leadership team reshuffled, policies were rewritten, and the engineering department started documenting everything more rigorously, not out of paranoia, but out of respect. Quietly, a new culture emerged, one where ideas were credited, voices were heard, and trust had to be earned. And though I no longer belonged to that place, I had left a fingerprint on its future. I never gave the media my side of the story. Let them wonder. Let the silence be louder than the lie. I wasn't interested in becoming a headline. I was interested in building things that outlived the noise. Because in the end, the loudest legacy is not what people say, it's what they trust you to build. I now wake up with a different sense of clarity. No tension in my chest, no pretending, just freedom. And if there's one thing I'd pass down to anyone reading this, it's this. Protect your voice, but never be afraid to go quiet. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one who says nothing, because he's already written the ending. Time has a way of revealing everything. The people who were once fooled by Alan began reaching out, not to apologize, but to reconnect. Old colleagues, former mentors, even a few executives who once sang his praises. Their messages came quietly, almost sheepishly. I had no idea you handled that with real class. I didn't respond to most of them, not out of spite, but because I no longer needed validation from people who once looked away. One message, though, stood out. It was from a junior engineer named Hannah, someone who had just started at the company during the fallout. She wrote, I saw how you carried yourself when everything went down. I hope one day I can lead like that. That single sentence made more impact than any public acknowledgement ever could, because that's the kind of legacy I wanted. Not fame, but quiet strength passed down like a blueprint. My new position gave me freedom, creative, financial, and personal. I traveled more. I finally had the time to study the systems that inspired me in the early days. I even started writing, not code, but essays about ethics in tech, about the soul of creation, about the importance of protecting intellectual labor in a world that's always rushing to package and sell it. I was no longer just a builder. I was a voice. Ironically, the very thing Alan tried to erase became the cornerstone of everything I built after. That algorithm, the one he thought he buried, ended up revolutionizing how mid-size companies handle traffic load. It became the core of multiple software offerings, and it taught me that sometimes when something precious is stolen, the only way to reclaim it is not by demanding it back, but by building it again, better, and making the world see it. One evening I walked past the building that used to house our old office. The glass still gleamed, but the company name had changed. New logo, new team. The past was wiped from the lobby wall. I stood there for a while, not in grief, not in nostalgia, but in stillness. That place didn't define me, it refined me, and that distinction meant everything. Some betrayals burn bridges, but others build the foundation of the next chapter. Alan didn't just underestimate my work, he underestimated my silence, and that, in the end, was the miscalculation that cost him everything. Years later, the full story still lives in fragments, conversations, rumors, lessons passed on in conference rooms. But the people who mattered never needed the details. They saw the outcome. They saw the arc. And most importantly, they saw that I never lost myself in the process. I didn't become bitter. I didn't become loud. I became exact, focused, sharper, not despite the betrayal, but because of it. One of my proudest moments came when a young developer I mentored released her first independent product. During her demo, she paused to thank those who taught her, especially Derek, she said, who taught me that quiet integrity is more powerful than loud ambition. That moment hit me harder than any award, any raise, any public recognition ever had, because she got it. She understood what all of this had been about. My work continues, but it no longer defines me. It fulfills me, yes, but it no longer owns me. I've found joy in balance, in knowing when to build and when to rest, in knowing when to speak and when to let the truth arrive on its own timing. Life became less about proving and more about preserving, and in that shift I found peace. I've long since archived the logs, the emails, the documents that held the proof. I no longer need them. They served their purpose, and now they rest, like evidence from a trial already judged by time. Alan's name faded from the industry entirely. No LinkedIn updates, no conference panels, just a blank space where noise used to live. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with sirens or applause. It comes with a whisper, a subtle change in the air, a door that quietly closes, a room that forgets the name of someone who once filled it. And in that silence, something beautiful grows, a new beginning, untainted by theft or noise. If I had the chance to go back and stop the betrayal before it happened, I wouldn't. Because the man who emerged from it is wiser, calmer, and infinitely more precise. And what I've learned, what I now teach, is that real power doesn't come from exposure. It comes from elevation. There's a moment in every story where you realize it was never about revenge. Not really. It was about returning to Tisha, about peeling off the layers that fear and betrayal wrapped around you and standing again in your own clarity. For me, that moment wasn't a dramatic reveal or some poetic confrontation. It was a quiet afternoon, watching a system I built run perfectly, uninterrupted, unclaimed, uncorrupted. I had spent years believing that being quiet meant being overlooked, that humility would somehow leave me behind in an industry obsessed with ego and speed. But now, I understand. Silence isn't weakness, it's mastery under pressure. It's knowing exactly when to wait, when to act, and when to walk away. Alan taught me that, not with his words, but with his theft. And I learned it, not through retaliation, but through transformation. What I hope anyone hearing this takes away is simple. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to expose someone to be vindicated. Sometimes, all it takes is letting your work breathe, letting your integrity rise, and letting time do what it does best, reveal everything. I didn't destroy Alan. I outlasted him, quietly, entirely, on my own terms. To the ones who've been dismissed, overlooked, or robbed of their voice, protect your ideas like you protect your heart. And when betrayal comes, and it will, don't rush to burn bridges. Study the path. Build your own. Make it so solid that when they try to follow you, they slip. That's how you win, without ever raising your voice. I sit here now, years removed from the theft, the summit, the silence, and I don't carry the weight anymore. I carry the wisdom. That's the final reward. Not the job, not the praise, not the quiet triumph. It's the unshakable knowing that I never had to become someone else to reclaim what was mine. I just had to become more of who I already was. And that, more than anything, is how I found peace. Not after the storm, but through it. Step by silent step.